What would you do if the man your daughter married stood in your driveway and told the movers to keep loading your late wife's furniture into a truck while your daughter watched and said nothing? My name is Walter, and until that morning, I believed my daughter would always stand between me and the people who wanted to take advantage of me. By noon that same day, I had frozen 4 accounts, called off a loan I never should have made, and sat alone in a house that suddenly felt too quiet. One phone call stopped a moving truck in its tracks. One phone call made a bank manager cancel a transfer he'd already approved. One phone call changed my daughter's marriage forever. But none of that happened because of anger. It happened because of what my daughter chose to do when her own father needed her most. Let me ask you something, friend. Have you ever watched somebody you raised stand next to a stranger and pick that stranger over you? Have you ever looked at your own child and realized, all at once, that the person in front of you wasn't the person you thought you knew? Because that's what happened to me on a gray Tuesday morning in March, in the driveway of the house where I raised her. Most people who hear this story assume the worst part was the furniture. It wasn't. Furniture can be replaced. What couldn't be replaced was the look on my daughter's face when she watched them carry my wife's cedar chest out the front door and didn't say a single word to stop it. That's the part that told me everything I needed to know about who she'd become. I didn't shout. I didn't chase the truck down the street. I made one phone call to my attorney, and by the time the sun went down, that phone call would cost my son-in-law more than he ever imagined a father-in-law could take away. If stories about family and betrayal hit close to home for you, go ahead and subscribe, and tell me down in the comments what state you're watching from tonight. What happens next is going to surprise you. To understand why I picked up that phone, you need to understand who I used to be, and who my daughter used to be before all this started. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 68 years old, and for 34 years, I ran a small auto parts supply company out of a warehouse in Marion, Ohio. My wife, Louise, and I built that business from nothing. We started with a used delivery van, a line of credit we were terrified to use, and a folding table in our garage that served as our first office. There were years, especially in the beginning, when we didn't know if we'd make payroll. I remember driving parts to customers myself at 5 in the morning because we couldn't afford a second driver yet. Louise did the books at our kitchen table after her shift at the hospital, balancing invoices with a calculator and a cup of coffee that had usually gone cold by the time she finished. We didn't have family money. We didn't have connections. What we had was stubbornness, and a belief that if we worked hard enough, we could give our daughter Emily a life neither of us had growing up. And we did. Emily never had to wonder if the lights would stay on. She never wore anything secondhand unless she wanted to. When she wanted to take horseback riding lessons at 11 years old, we found a way to pay for it, even during a year when the business barely broke even. When she got into Ohio State, Louise and I paid every semester in full so she could graduate without a single dollar of debt. I still remember the day we dropped her off at her dorm. She hugged us both so hard I thought she'd never let go, and she told us she'd never forget everything we sacrificed. For a long time, I believed her. Louise passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by August. I won't pretend that grief doesn't still sit in my chest most mornings, when I wake up in a bed that's too big for one person. Emily was wonderful in those final months. She flew home every other weekend. She sat with her mother during chemo. She held my hand at the funeral and told me she'd always be there for me, no matter what. I believed that too. Then, about 2 years ago, Emily met Marcus. When she first brought him around, I understood the appeal. Marcus was sharp, well-dressed, quick with a compliment. He shook my hand firmly and asked good questions about the business, the kind of questions that made you think he was actually listening. The first few months, he was pleasant enough. He complimented my grilling. He laughed at my old stories about Louise, the ones I'd told 100 times. Nothing seemed out of place, at least not at first. The small things started slow, the way they always do. We went out one evening to Baumgartner's, a diner on Route 30 that Louise and I had eaten at every Sunday for 20 years. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. Halfway through the meal, Marcus looked around at the vinyl booths and the handwritten specials board and said, loud enough for the table next to us to hear, "People still eat at places like this?" He said it with a smile, like it was a joke between friends. It wasn't a joke. I noticed Emily laugh along with him. That one stung more than I let on. Another time, at a 4th of July cookout at my house, Marcus snapped his fingers at my neighbor's teenage son to bring him another beer from the cooler, like the kid was hired help instead of a 15-year-old doing me a favor. When my neighbor mentioned it later, a little uncomfortable, Marcus brushed it off like it hadn't even happened. But the moment that bothered me most came a few months before the wedding. I was telling a story at dinner about the year Louise and I almost lost the warehouse lease back when Emily was in middle school. It was one of my favorite stories, because it was the year we almost gave up and didn't. Marcus interrupted me halfway through. "I think you're misremembering that," he said, like he'd been there, like he knew our own history better than I did. It wasn't true, and it wasn't necessary. Emily laughed it off and changed the subject. I didn't laugh. I noticed the way Emily looked at Marcus afterward, not embarrassed for me, but almost proud of him for saying it. As the wedding planning went on, Marcus's expectations got bigger every month. Every dinner had to be at the newest place downtown. Every gift had to be upgraded. When Emily mentioned that Marcus wanted a more sophisticated honeymoon than the one they'd originally planned, meaning a resort in the Maldives instead of the cabin in the Smokies they'd talked about for a year, I paid the difference without complaint. When he mentioned, almost in passing, that it would mean a lot to his family if the wedding venue was upgraded to the Vineyard instead of the community hall Emily had loved since she was a little girl, I paid that too. What worried me more than any of it was watching my daughter change. The girl who used to help me organize inventory in the warehouse on weekends, who used to introduce me to her college friends as my dad, he built this whole company from a garage, started introducing me differently. At a party a few months before the wedding, I heard her tell someone, "My dad's retired, he used to run some auto parts thing. 34 years, and it had become some auto parts thing." I told myself it was nerves, wedding stress. I told myself things would go back to normal once the ceremony was behind us. I was wrong. The wedding happened in October, at that vineyard Marcus's family had pushed for. It was a beautiful day, cool and clear, the kind of fall afternoon Louise would have loved. I stood near the back during the ceremony and thought about how much she would have cried, seeing Emily walk down that aisle. I cried a little myself, and for a moment, watching my daughter in her mother's pearl earrings, I let myself believe everything was fine. After the ceremony, during photos, Marcus's mother, Diane, pulled me aside near the parking area. She said she wanted to talk about logistics for after the wedding. I assumed she meant the reception seating or the timeline for the toasts. Instead, she asked me, very casually, whether I'd thought any more about helping the kids get settled. I told her Emily and Marcus were welcome to visit any time. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "That's not quite what I meant, Walter." I didn't understand what she meant until 5 months later, standing in my own driveway. Because here's what I didn't know that day, what nobody told me until it was almost too late. 2 months after the wedding, Marcus had approached my bank, the same bank Louise and I had used for 30 years, and asked a loan officer named Patricia about co-signing arrangements on a home equity line, using my house as collateral. He didn't ask me. He asked Patricia, who happened to remember me from decades of business, and who happened to call me the next day just to confirm the family was aware, because something about the paperwork felt off to her. I told her I knew nothing about it. She apologized and said the request had been withdrawn. I should have said something to Emily that week. I should have sat her down and asked her directly what was going on. Instead, I told myself it was a misunderstanding, that maybe Marcus had gotten ahead of himself, that surely my daughter wouldn't let something like that happen without telling me first. Looking back now, that was my first real mistake. I kept giving both of them the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt had earned itself. Then came the Tuesday in March. I'd invited Emily and Marcus over that weekend to talk about something I'd been sitting on for months. I wanted to give them the house on Larkspur Lane, the one Louise and I bought as a rental property 15 years ago and paid off completely 8 years later. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. 3 bedrooms, good bones, in a quiet neighborhood 2 miles from where I lived. I'd been planning to surprise them with the deed as a late wedding gift, something Louise and I had actually talked about years before she got sick, back when we still imagined what Emily's future family might look like. I hadn't told anyone about the plan yet, not even Emily. I wanted it to be a surprise. That Tuesday morning, I drove over to Larkspur Lane to check on a leaky faucet the tenant had mentioned before moving out the month before. I was planning the surprise for that weekend. Instead, I pulled into the driveway and found a moving truck already backed up to the front door, back gate open, ramp down. 2 men I didn't recognize were carrying furniture out of the house. Not the tenant's furniture. The tenant had already moved out weeks earlier and taken everything with him. This was the furniture I'd put in storage after Louise passed. Furniture from our first house together. The cedar chest she'd inherited from her own mother. The dining table, where we'd eaten every holiday for 20 years. The rocking chair I used to sit in when Emily was a baby and wouldn't sleep unless someone was holding her. I'd asked Marcus, weeks earlier, if he and Emily wanted to store a few pieces at Larkspur Lane temporarily while they redid their own place. I said yes, because I trusted them. I never imagined store a few pieces meant move in Louise's cedar chest and quietly start treating the house like it already belonged to them. Marcus was standing on the porch, directing the movers like he owned the place, phone in one hand, coffee in the other. And standing a few feet away from him, arms crossed, watching the movers carry my late wife's belongings into a truck, was my daughter. I walked up the driveway, and for a moment nobody noticed me. "What's going on here?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Marcus turned around, and I want to be clear, friend, he didn't look guilty. He looked mildly annoyed, like I'd interrupted something. "Oh, hey Walter," he said. "We're just getting a head start on the move. Figured since the place is basically ours now, might as well get settled before the paperwork catches up. Basically ours now." Those 3 words landed like a slap. I looked at Emily. "Is that true?" I asked her directly. "Did I miss something? Did we talk about this and I forgot?" This is the part I need you to understand, friend, because it's the part that changed everything for me. Emily didn't rush to explain. She didn't look surprised. She looked, for just a second, like she'd been caught, and then her face settled into something almost defensive. "Dad, Marcus and I have been talking about this for a while," she said. "You always said the house would be for us eventually. We just figured, why wait? Why wait?" As if a 15-year-old rental property Louise and I bought with our own hands, paid off with our own money, was simply sitting there waiting for someone else's timeline. I felt something crack in my chest, and it had nothing to do with the furniture. "I never gave you that house," I said. "I never even mentioned giving you that house. Who told you it was yours?" Marcus answered before Emily could. "Come on, Walter, don't be dramatic. You're 68. You've got no mortgage, a paid-off business, and you're rattling around alone in that big house since Louise passed. It's not like you need 2 properties." He said it so casually, like he was reading off a grocery list, like my wife's name in his mouth was just another line item in his argument. I looked at my daughter again, waiting for her to say something, anything, to push back on what he'd just said. She looked at the ground instead. That was the moment. Not the furniture on the truck. Not Marcus calling the house basically ours. The moment my daughter looked at the ground instead of looking at me. I didn't yell. I want you to know that, because I know how these stories usually go, and I know what you might be picturing. There was no shouting match in that driveway. I simply said, "Stop loading the truck." The movers, to their credit, looked between me and Marcus, and clearly had no idea whose driveway this actually was. I told them plainly, "This is my property. Nothing leaves this house today." One of them looked relieved to have permission to stop. They set down the chest they were carrying, right there on the porch, and waited. Marcus started to argue. Something about how this was a family matter, and I was making a scene in front of strangers. I looked at him and said the only thing I had energy left to say. "You're right. It is a family matter. So let me handle it like family." I pulled out my phone and called my attorney, a man named Robert Callahan who had handled every piece of paper Louise and I ever signed for 30 years. He picked up on the second ring. "Walter, everything all right?" I stood there in the driveway, watching my daughter avoid my eyes and my son-in-law check his watch, like this whole conversation was cutting into his afternoon. "No," I said. "Nothing's all right. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it today." Have you ever had to make a decision like that, friend? Standing in a driveway, watching your daughter stay silent, while a stranger tried to take something that belonged to the woman you loved for 30 years. Tell me down below, because I want to know I'm not the only one. I told Robert everything, not every detail, just enough. The moving truck, the furniture, the comment about the house being basically theirs. I told him about the call from Patricia at the bank 2 months earlier too, the one I'd let slide. Robert was quiet for a second. He'd known Louise. He'd drafted her will. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Here's something I hadn't told either Emily or Marcus. Something that turned out to matter more than anything else that day. Larkspur Lane wasn't the only asset I'd quietly been discussing with Robert. 2 years earlier, right after Emily got engaged, I'd set up a modest trust to help fund a down payment for her and Marcus's first home together. Something separate from Larkspur Lane entirely. A gesture of goodwill I'd been planning to formalize as a wedding gift. The trust wasn't finalized yet. It existed only as a draft sitting in Robert's office, waiting on my signature. "Cancel the trust paperwork," I told him. "Don't file it. It doesn't exist." "Done," Robert said. "What about Larkspur Lane? Change the locks this week. And call Patricia at First Marion. Tell her I want every joint account closed, effective today. Anything with my name on it that Marcus has access to, whether I authorized it or not, I want it locked down and reviewed." There was a brief pause on the line while Robert absorbed that. "I'll have it done by end of day," he said. I hadn't realized, until that moment, that in the 18 months since the wedding, Emily had quietly added Marcus as an authorized user on the joint checking account I'd set up for her years ago, the one I still contributed to occasionally to help with unexpected expenses. She hadn't asked me. She'd just done it, assuming, I suppose, that I'd never checked the paperwork closely enough to notice. I did notice. That day, sitting in my car in the Larkspur Lane driveway, after the movers had left empty-handed, I called Patricia myself and asked her to walk me through every transaction on that account for the past year. What I found wasn't catastrophic. Not thousands of dollars disappearing, nothing criminal. But there were withdrawals I didn't recognize. Small ones. A few $100s here, a few hundred there, always timed close to when Marcus mentioned some new expense. A suit for a work event. A golf club membership, he said, would be good for networking. Emily's name was on the withdrawals. Her signature, not his. That hurt worse than the furniture ever could have. I called Robert back one more time. "One more thing," I said. "Emily's name is on my will as executor. I want that changed too. Not removed from the will itself. She's still my daughter. She's still getting what's fair. But I don't want her handling anything alone anymore. Add a co-executor. Someone neutral. I can have papers ready by Thursday," Robert said. When I hung up, I sat in that driveway for a long time, looking at the house Louise and I had bought together, the one I'd been planning to hand over out of love, and instead had to lock down out of self-protection. I thought about the folding table in our garage 34 years ago. I thought about Louise doing the books with a cold cup of coffee. I thought about every winter morning I drove parts across 3 counties so we could keep the lights on for a daughter who, decades later, would stand in a driveway and say nothing while her husband picked through her mother's furniture like it was already his. I didn't cry. I want to tell you I did, because maybe that would sound more human, but honestly, I just felt tired. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with my age. That Thursday, 3 days later, Emily called me. I almost didn't answer. When I finally did, her voice was different than it had been in the driveway. Smaller somehow. "Dad," Robert's office called Marcus. Said the trust for the house is canceled. Said our joint account is frozen. "What's going on? Why would you do this to us?" "To us. Not to Marcus. To us." That told me she still hadn't separated herself from him in her own mind, even after everything. "I didn't do anything to you," I said. "I stopped doing something for someone who's never once shown me or your mother's memory a shred of respect." "That's different." "He's my husband," she said. "You can't just punish him without punishing me." "I'm not trying to punish anyone," I told her. "I'm trying to protect what's left of what your mother and I built. You were standing in that driveway too, Emily. You watched them carry your mother's chest out the door, and you didn't say a word, not one word. Do you understand what that told me?" There was a long silence on the line. I could hear her breathing, could almost picture her standing in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, trying to find an answer that would make this easier for both of us. She didn't have one. "I didn't know what to say," she finally admitted. "Marcus said you'd basically already promised the house. I didn't want to make it worse by arguing with him in front of the movers." "You didn't want to make it worse for him," I said quietly. "What about me? What about your mother's cedar chest, sitting on a moving truck without anyone asking my permission?" She didn't answer that either. I told her something then that I'd been turning over in my head since Tuesday. "Emily, I'm not cutting you off. You're my daughter, and nothing changes that. But I need you to understand something. Your mother and I didn't work every weekend for 30 years, didn't skip vacations, didn't sacrifice everything we had, so that a man who's known me for 2 years could stand on my porch and tell me what's basically his. That house isn't his. That trust isn't his. Your mother's cedar chest isn't his. And honestly, right now, I'm not sure what is yours either, because you didn't act like any of it mattered to you when it counted." "So what happens now?" she asked. And for the first time in months, she sounded less like a wife, defending her husband, and more like the girl who used to sit in the warehouse office, doing her homework, while I closed out the register. "Now," I said, "you figure out who you are when nobody's watching, because that's what your mother always used to say. Character shows up when nobody expects consequences. You had a chance to show me who you are in that driveway, and I saw it clearly. What you do next is up to you." We didn't resolve everything on that call. I won't pretend it was some clean, tidy ending, the kind you see in movies. Emily and I have talked twice since then. Careful conversations, both of us still finding our footing. Marcus, from what I understand, is furious and has told mutual friends I overreacted and humiliated him in front of the moving company. Maybe I did embarrass him. I've made my peace with that. I spent 34 years building something out of nothing, so that my daughter would never have to worry about the things Louise and I worried about. I never built it so a man who calls my late wife's memory basically his could walk through my life unearning everything he touches. Larkspur Lane is still mine. The locks are changed. The trust doesn't exist. And every account I control has my name on it, and no one else's. For the first time in 18 months, I think about Louise a lot these days, more than usual. I think about what she'd say if she could see her cedar chest sitting back in my garage instead of some stranger's living room. I think she'd tell me I did the right thing, even if it took me longer than it should have to see what was happening in front of me. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that love and generosity are not obligations. Nobody is entitled to what you built just because they married into your family. Respect has to be earned every single day, by everyone, including the people closest to you. Money can build a business. It can build a house. It cannot build character, and no amount of it should ever be handed to someone who hasn't shown you they deserve it. So, let me ask you the same question I've been asking myself every night since that Tuesday in March. Did I go too far, locking down those accounts and taking back a house I never officially gave away? Or did my daughter and her husband earn every bit of what happened after that driveway? Tell me what you think, friend. I read every single comment.